In a small clinic office in the city of Kiel in the autumn of 1958, a German psychiatrist sat at a wooden desk beneath a single lamp and wrote a word that had never existed before. His name was Klaus Conrad. The room around him was quiet, in the way that clinical rooms are quiet in the evening, not empty, but settled, the sounds of the building having receded into the walls. He pressed the nib of his pen into the page with the particular firmness of someone who has been searching a long time for the right container for an idea, and the word he wrote was apophenia. He had built it from the Greek. The roots mean something close to away and to show, a showing away, or perhaps a showing forth of something that was not quite there. Conrad was working on a monograph about the earliest stages of schizophrenic experience, trying to describe something he had observed in patient after patient, a moment early in the illness when the world suddenly seemed to be speaking directly to them, not through voices, not yet, through patterns, through the sense that unrelated things, a car turning left, a stranger's shoe color, the number on a door, were connected in a way that felt certain, urgent, and specifically meant. Conrad watched this phenomenon carefully, and because careful observation of a thing usually leads, eventually, to the need for a name, he invented one. The word he wrote that evening has since traveled far beyond the context in which it was coined. Psychologists use it. Cognitive scientists use it. Neuroscientists use it in papers that would have been entirely alien to Conrad's mid-century clinic, papers full of imaging data and activation maps and discussions of neural architecture that Conrad could not have predicted and might have found both thrilling and bewildering in roughly equal measure. The word has spread because the thing it names is not confined to any particular population or any particular set of circumstances. It turns out that what Conrad was describing in his schizophrenic patients was a version of something that every human brain does, every day, as a matter of ordinary course. The difference is a matter of degree and of what happens next. A brain in the process of perceiving the world is not a passive receiver. It does not wait for information to arrive and then react to it. What the imaging research shows, the kind of research conducted with functional MRI scanners that can map neural activity in real time, slice by thin slice across a living working brain, is that the brain begins generating predictions about incoming sensory data before the data has been fully processed. It is already modeling what it expects to find, already reaching forward into the stream of sensation and constructing a version of what is probably there, based on everything it has encountered before, so that when the actual information arrives, it is partly confirming or correcting a hypothesis that the brain has already formed. This is efficient. It is, from an evolutionary standpoint, a design that makes a great deal of sense. An organism that must fully process every piece of incoming sensory data from scratch before it can respond to any of it is an organism at a significant disadvantage in an environment that contains things moving toward it with speed and intent. The brain that is already committed to a working model of the world, that has already decided this rustle is probably wind, that shape is probably a branch, that movement at the edge of the visual field is probably nothing, can allocate its attention more usefully. It can be wrong, and in most cases the cost of being wrong is small. It can also be right, in ways that over the long history of the species have mattered considerably. The relevant consequence of this architecture is that the brain will find patterns. It will find them in things that contain them, and it will find them in things that do not. The same machinery that allows the brain to recognize a face in a fraction of a second, before the conscious mind has quite registered what it is looking at, will generate the outline of a face in wood grain, in cloud formations, in the arrangement of shadows on a wall. This is not a malfunction. It is the instrument doing exactly what the instrument was built to do, operating at the high end of its sensitivity range. In a laboratory at the University of Southern California, a researcher named Irving Biederman and his colleagues published a study in 2009 that added a layer to this picture that is worth sitting with quietly for a moment. Biederman's research suggested that recognizing patterns is not merely efficient, but genuinely pleasurable. The act of resolution, the moment when a shape comes together into something identifiable, when the scattered elements of a scene cohere into a meaningful arrangement, appears to be mediated in part by opioid receptors connected to dopaminergic pathways in the brain. In other words, the brain rewards itself for finding patterns. A small, clean biochemical signal of satisfaction is generated at the moment of recognition. The brain notices that it has successfully done the thing it was built to do, and it marks the occasion. This means that pattern finding is not simply something the brain does. It is something the brain wants to do. The pleasure is real, even when the pattern is not. The soft satisfaction of seeing a face appear in the grain of a floorboard, or of noticing that three unrelated events share a number, that quiet sense of recognition, of connection, of the world briefly cohering, is grounded in actual neurochemistry. The brain is producing something real in response to something imagined, and from the inside, the two experiences are very difficult to distinguish. At the University of Toronto, a group of researchers published findings in 2009 that shifted the picture again. Their study had induced a temporary state of anxiety in participants, a mild, manageable psychological discomfort, and then measured how frequently those participants reported seeing faces in random visual noise, still photographs, screens of gray static, images that contained no faces. What the researchers found was that the anxious participants reported seeing faces significantly more often than the non-anxious ones. The same brain, in a higher state of alert, was reaching further into the noise. It was more willing to commit to a pattern, more eager, in the particular way that anxious systems are eager, to resolve ambiguity into something nameable. The implication is that pattern perception is not a fixed property of a given mind. It is a dial. It moves. It is calibrated in real time by the brain's assessment of the environment and the level of threat that environment might contain. A brain that believes it is in danger, even slightly, even in the low-grade, generalized way that modern anxiety produces, becomes more aggressive about finding patterns in the world around it. It looks harder. It commits faster. It is less willing to let a possible signal go unregistered, because in a world that might be dangerous, an unregistered signal could be the one that matters. This is not a flaw in the instrument. It is the instrument responding rationally to its own estimate of the situation. The pattern seeking accelerates precisely when the brain judges that more pattern seeking might be warranted. The problem, if there is a problem, and it is worth being careful about the word, is that the emotional state driving the calibration does not always match the actual danger level of the environment. Anxiety felt in a quiet room, in the absence of any physical threat, can still move the dial, can still make the grain of the floorboard look more like a face, can still make three coincidental numbers feel more like a sequence. The German clinic where Conrad worked is relevant here precisely because he was watching a version of this process at its most intense, a version in which the pattern finding had become, to use the clinical language carefully and without alarm, fixed. What his patients experienced was not the passing impression of a face in the woodwork, noticed and then released with a faint smile. It was the certainty of a message, a signal, a pattern that had been placed there deliberately and was meant for them specifically, and the certainty was resistant. It did not yield to counter-argument. The patient, who was gently told that the number on the door was simply the number on the door, assigned in sequence to the rooms of a building, would not be persuaded. The pattern was too certain. The feeling of connection was too strong. Clinical psychology has a formal distinction for this. On one side of the line sits apophenia, as it operates in neurotypical experience, the ordinary pattern finding that every brain performs, the face in the wood grain, the number appearing 3 times in a week, the sense of connection between unrelated events. A person in this territory, when gently asked whether the pattern might be coincidence, can usually acknowledge the possibility. They may not fully believe it. The pattern may still feel real and significant, but they can hold the question open. They can say, probably nothing, and mean it loosely, even if they keep watching. On the other side of the line sits what the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders defines as delusional thinking, a fixed belief that is maintained with certainty and is resistant to rational counter-argument, even in the face of evidence that most people would consider decisive. The distinction matters, and Conrad was describing the process by which a mind can cross from one territory into the other. But for the vast majority of people, on the vast majority of occasions, the pattern finding stays on the near side of that line. It stays in the territory of impression, of interesting coincidence, of something that feels like it might mean something without demanding that it must. A person standing on a rain-wet street in the late afternoon, looking at the building across from them, might notice that 2 windows and a door handle have arranged themselves, in the gray light, into something that looks, just for a moment, just at this angle, unmistakably like a watching face. The impression arrives before the reasoning does. The face is already there before the mind has finished receiving the information that would allow it to know whether a face should be expected. And then the mind catches up, the interpretation adjusts, and the face dissolves back into windows and metal. The whole thing lasts perhaps a second, perhaps 2. It leaves behind nothing more than a faint trace of something noticed, something briefly felt, already fading as the person continues down the street. This is the fusiform face area doing its work. This small region of the brain, sitting in the temporal lobe, is specialized for face recognition to a degree that makes it one of the most studied pieces of neural real estate in all of cognitive neuroscience. Activation in the fusiform gyrus can be recorded the moment a face-like arrangement enters the visual field, and crucially, it activates for face-like arrangements whether or not an actual face is present. The region does not wait for confirmation. It responds to the configuration, 2 points suggesting eyes, a longer feature suggesting a mouth, roughly aligned in the orientation typical of a face. Wood grain, cloud, shadow, noise, all of them can trigger the response if the configuration is close enough. In laboratories where this is studied, researchers present participants with photographs of objects, bark, rock faces, satellite images of terrain, close-up images of crumpled fabric. Among these images, they include arrangements that contain no face, but have the rough spatial relationship of facial features. The participant's fusiform gyrus activates. The participant reports seeing a face. And sometimes, this is the part that the imaging data makes visible in a way that no amount of careful introspection could. The activation occurs before the participant has consciously registered that they have seen anything. The brain has already responded. The report follows the response. A researcher watching this happen on a monitor in a dimly lit laboratory, the brain scan lighting up in soft orange across the fusiform gyrus at the moment the participant glimpses a face-like arrangement of shadows in a photograph of wood grain, is watching something that has been happening for as long as human brains have been the kind of brains they currently are. The scanning technology is recent, the phenomenon is not. The faces people have seen in stones, in clouds, in the patterns of leaves on water, in the darkness at the edge of firelight, these are the same process, the same region, the same millisecond of committed pattern resolution firing before the reasoning arrives. What Conrad did, sitting at that desk in 1958, was give this family of experiences a single address. Before he wrote the word down, the phenomenon existed in pieces. It existed in the clinical literature as a symptom, in the philosophical literature as a puzzle, in everyday experience as something that happened to people, and that they might describe variously as a coincidence, a premonition, or simply an interesting thing they had noticed. Conrad gathered the pieces and placed them under one roof. He said, "This is a thing. This thing has a name. The name is apophenia." The naming did not solve anything. Conrad was not making a claim about whether the patterns people perceived were real or not, in some deeper metaphysical sense. He was describing a process, a particular way the mind relates to the world, a particular tendency that sits in the architecture of perception itself. He was writing carefully, in the way that clinical writers write when they are describing something they have observed closely and want to preserve accurately, and the word he pressed into the page that evening in Kiel has survived because it names something that has not gone away, and that closer investigation has made more rather than less interesting. The biochemistry has confirmed what Conrad could only observe behaviorally. The imaging has confirmed what the biochemistry suggested. The result is a picture of a brain that is, at the most fundamental level of its operation, a pattern-finding instrument of extraordinary sensitivity, one that was built to solve exactly this problem, finding meaningful configurations in a complex and ambiguous world, and that runs this solving process continuously, automatically, and with a level of eagerness that the conscious mind is rarely aware of and has no reliable way to switch off. A study participant in a dim laboratory room, seated before a monitor filled with gray static, their finger hovering above a button they have been asked to press when they see a face, is running the same software as every human being who has ever stared at a fire and seen a shape move in the coals. The static contains no faces. The participant knows this. In the cognitive sense of knowing, they have been told. They have accepted the information. They hold it, and still the finger moves to the button. Still the face arrives. Briefly, out of the noise, the brain has committed to it. The report has followed. In the moment of recognition, the small, clean arrival of a pattern from apparent randomness carries with it the neurochemical signature of something that feels, however faintly, like satisfaction. This is the instrument. This is how it runs. The patterns that appear to people, in numbers, in events, in the coincidences of daily life, do not arise because the world is secretly organized around human attention. They arise because the brain is secretly organized around the world, tuned to its surfaces and its repetitions, eager to find in the noise whatever structure might be there, and willing, when necessary, to find structure that is not. The willingness is not a bug. It is not a sign of weakness, credulity, or any failure of rational thinking. It is the cost of a design that has, on balance, served the species extremely well. The same sensitivity that generates false positives in the static generates true positives in the data of actual experience, often before the slower machinery of deliberate attention has finished its work. The brain's pattern finding tends to err on the side of finding too much rather than too little, because in the long history of the environments where human brains were shaped, finding too little was the more dangerous error. Conrad understood this, at least partially. His monograph was not a condemnation of the patients he was describing. It was an attempt to locate their experience within the broader landscape of what human minds do, to show where the ordinary process had been extended or intensified into something that required clinical attention. He was not saying that seeing patterns was wrong. He was saying that the distance between ordinary pattern seeing and something more fixed was smaller than it might appear, and that the line between them was drawn not by the patterns themselves, but by what happened after they were noticed. For most people, what happens after is a shrug, a quiet acknowledgement, a kind of soft wondering that does not demand resolution and does not resist the possibility that the pattern was nothing more than the brain doing what brains do, which is look for something familiar in whatever material is placed in front of them. The face in the wood grain is noticed and released. The coincidental number is registered and set down. The pattern arrives and departs without leaving a demand behind it. There is a kind of comfort available in understanding this, not the comfort of having explained something away, but the comfort of seeing something clearly. The brain is doing its oldest and most practiced job. It has been doing this job for a very long time in a very large number of environments, and it is exceptionally good at it. The patterns that appear in the static, in the numbers, in the grain of wood, in the coincidences of an ordinary life, are the traces of this work, evidence of an instrument running its most basic and most ancient program, looking, always looking, for the shape of something known in the middle of everything unknown. In the laboratory, the brain scan continues to glow. The fusiform face area is lit in soft orange. The participant has pressed the button. The face they saw was not there, and the brain that saw it is doing exactly what it was built to do, reaching into the dark with the full force of its pattern-finding architecture, and finding, as it almost always does, something that looks, at least for a moment, like something it recognizes. The moment passes, the glow fades on the monitor, the participant blinks, resets, waits for the next image to appear, and the brain, patient as it has always been, returns to the beginning of its program and starts again, ready to find the next face in the next arrangement of gray noise, doing the only thing it has ever known how to do, quietly and without fatigue, in whatever dark it finds itself in. Conrad closed his monograph. The lamp on his desk in Kiel had made a small circle of warm light on the page. Outside the clinic, the autumn city continued in its ordinary way, full of people looking at things and finding, in the things they looked at, the shapes they were best equipped to find. He capped his pen. The word apophenia sat in its ink on the page, finished, named, held still at last after years of being only an observation. It was, by any reasonable measure, an ordinary evening. And the brain that had spent it working, his brain, the instrument behind every careful observation and every precisely chosen word, had been doing what it always does, looking, finding, settling for a moment into the particular quiet that comes when something has been named that did not have a name before. The fusiform gyrus does not distinguish between the face in the clinic window and the face in the static on the laboratory screen. It sees what it is built to see. It finds what it is built to find. And the brain that contains it, all the brains that contain it, in all the rooms that are growing quieter now in the slow drift of a late evening, are simply doing the oldest job there is, looking out into whatever surrounds them, finding in the patterns of the world the patterns they already carry, mistaking, now and then, the one for the other, and returning, after each mistake, to the patient work of looking again. The harbor at Tangier sits at the edge of two seas. In the early 1960s, the afternoon light came off the water at a particular angle in the hours before dusk, flattening everything it touched: the painted hulls of fishing boats, the pale walls of the Medina above the port, the oilcloth tops of the harborside tables where expatriates and traders and wanderers gathered in the late heat to drink coffee and talk about almost nothing. William S. Burroughs was often among them. He had come to Tangier some years earlier, drawn by the looseness of the place, by its quality of existing slightly outside the ordinary rules of geography and belonging, and he had stayed. He sat at those tables with the particular stillness of a man who was always watching, always listening, a notebook generally within reach, a pen generally in his hand. It was at one of those tables, or something very like one, that a man named Captain Clark first appeared in what would become a long and peculiar story. Clark was a ferry captain. He had been running the same short crossing, or a crossing very like it, for 23 years, not a long career by some measures, but long enough. The crossing was ordinary, the passengers were ordinary, the route was ordinary, and for 23 years, Clark had made it without a single accident, which is the kind of record that eventually becomes the thing a person is known for, a source of a quiet, earned confidence. Burroughs met him, or encountered him, or heard of him, the exact circumstances softened over time in the way that harbor stories do, and noted the 23 years the way a person notes any specific detail that feels, without immediately knowing why, worth holding on to. The same day, or very close to it, Clark's ferry went down. Every account of the story agrees on that part. And then, on the radio that same evening, Burroughs heard a report about a plane crash. The plane had been operated by an airline pilot whose name was also Clark. The flight was designated Flight 23. Burroughs wrote the number down. He drew a circle around it. The circle was the beginning of something. What he was doing, sitting at that harbor table with a pen in his hand, was not so different from what people have always done at edges, at the places where land meets water, where one day ends and another begins, where a thing that should not happen has just happened anyway. He was looking for the shape of it. He was looking for the number that might be at the center of the shape, and the number he found, or the number that found him, was 23. Burroughs mentioned it to other writers. He mentioned it in correspondence. He mentioned it in the particular obsessive, cataloging way that characterized his thinking about the world, which was the thinking of a man who had always been more interested in how connections formed than in whether those connections were real. He was precise about the story of Captain Clark. He was precise about the flight number. He was not interested in proving that the number meant something. He was interested in the fact that it kept appearing, and in what that appearing might say about the nature of attention, about the relationship between a mind that is looking for something and a world that seems, from a certain angle, to provide it. That angle, once found, proved extremely difficult to lose. Robert Anton Wilson came to the 23 enigma through Burroughs, directly, having known him through the overlapping circles of American literary and countercultural life in the 1960s. Wilson was a different kind of thinker, more systematic, more playful, and genuinely interested in the philosophy of belief itself. He was drawn not just to the number, but to the question the number raised, which was the question of whether a person who was looking for something could trust their own perception of whether they had found it. He thought this was among the more interesting questions a person could spend time with, and he spent considerable time with it. The Illuminatus trilogy, written with Robert Shea and published in 3 volumes between 1975 and 1984, embedded the 23 enigma throughout its architecture. The books are not easy to summarize. They exist in a sustained state of productive ambiguity, assembling an enormous catalog of conspiracy theories, countercultural mythology, genuine history, and invented history into a structure that makes it sincerely difficult to determine on any given page whether the authors believe what they are describing or are laughing at it, and that difficulty is precisely the point. The number 23 appears throughout, in dates, in chapter counts, in names, in the fine print of documents that characters discover in the margins of other documents. Wilson understood that the number had a particular property, which was that once a person began looking for it, it appeared everywhere, and that this appearance, while entirely explicable as selective attention, could not be made to feel explicable by anyone in the grip of it. A paperback copy of the first volume, the kind that might have been bought from a second-hand shop in the late 1970s, the pages already thick and slightly warped from having been read in a bath, shows the marks of a previous reader's attention: pencil underlinings, asterisks in margins. And on one particular page, the number 23 circled 3 times in increasingly firm pencil strokes, as though the reader had returned to it on separate occasions and each time felt compelled to acknowledge it again. The circling is not an argument. It is something older than an argument. It is the gesture of a person who has noticed something and wants to register the noticing. The story of a number, it turns out, can be carried by the right voices for a surprisingly long distance. To understand why 23 in particular gathered this kind of attention, it helps to know something about what the number is in the strict technical sense. 23 is a prime number, divisible only by itself and by 1. Prime numbers have a quality that is genuinely worth attending to, which is that they resist the ordinary processes of factorization that allow most numbers to be broken down into simpler components. They stand alone. In a world where most numbers can be understood as products of smaller numbers, where 12 is 3 times 4, and 24 is 8 times 3, and so on indefinitely, a prime number declines to participate in that system of relationships. It simply is what it is. The number 23 falls in a part of the numerical range that is common enough to appear regularly in human affairs, in addresses, in ages, in dates, in chromosome counts, but distinctive enough that its appearances feel notable rather than ordinary. The 23 pairs of chromosomes in the human genome is perhaps the most frequently cited example among those who maintain catalogs of the number's appearances, and it is worth pausing on that example for a moment. The human diploid number, 46 chromosomes arranged in 23 pairs, is a product of evolutionary history, the result of specific chromosomal fusions and separations across millions of years of primate development. It has nothing to do with any of the other contexts in which 23 appears. It has nothing to do with Captain Clark or Robert Anton Wilson or the timing of a flight report on a harbor radio. It is simply a count arrived at by the particular path evolution took, and that count happens to produce a pair number whose half is 23. The fact that this feels connected to the other appearances of the number is not evidence of a connection. It is evidence of something the mind does automatically when it has been oriented toward a particular figure. It finds that figure, and the finding feels meaningful, and the meaningful feeling is real, even when the connection is not. Julius Caesar was reportedly stabbed 23 times in the theater of Pompeii on the Ides of March in 44 BCE. This is one of those historical facts whose precision carries a small weight of doubt, the number appears in Suetonius, writing more than a century after the event, and while the detail has been repeated consistently enough to enter the general historical record, the precision of the count is the kind of thing that can be confirmed or contested only so far before the evidence simply runs out. What is clear is that the Senate's attack on Caesar was carried out by multiple men with multiple blades. What 23 adds to that picture, in terms of historical understanding, is not very much. What it adds to the catalog of 23 appearances, in the eyes of those maintaining such a catalog, is considerable. The Boards of Canada, a Scottish electronic music duo, released a track titled 23 Degrees North, 82 Degrees West. The coordinates in that title locate a position in the Gulf of Mexico, somewhere in the waters between Cuba and the Yucatan Peninsula, a point on the ocean's surface that has no inherent significance beyond the fact that the numbers in it include 23. The track itself is largely instrumental, atmospheric, and slow, the kind of music that invites a certain quality of attention, an attention that is open rather than focused, that follows association rather than argument. For listeners who were already oriented toward the 23 enigma, the track became another entry in the list, another instance of the number appearing where it might easily not have appeared. For listeners who were not so oriented, it was simply an interesting piece of music with an unusual title. The track did not change the number, it added a frame around it. In 2007, a film called The Number 23 was released into theaters in the United States. It was directed by Joel Schumacher and starred Jim Carrey in a departure from the comedic roles he had spent most of his career in, playing a man who becomes convinced that a novel he is reading was written about him and that its central obsession with the number 23 is an encoded record of his own hidden crimes. The film was released on February 23, 2007. Its supporters noted that the release date was itself a piece of intentional encoding, the studio leaning into the mythology of the number by embedding the film's opening day into the pattern it described. Its detractors noted that a February release date for a modestly budgeted thriller is not unusual, and that the 23rd of any month falls with the same regularity as any other date. The film received a score of approximately 8% on the review aggregator Rotten Tomatoes, making it one of the more durably negative critical receptions of that decade. It also developed a lasting cult following. The usher walking the aisle of a theater on that February evening in 2007 in one of the larger American cities where the film played to scattered audiences would have seen something worth noting. The screen filled with Jim Carrey's face, in a state of focused, widened alarm, the face of a person who has found a pattern and cannot stop finding it, who discovers the number 23 in the measurements of a room, in the letters of a name, in the time shown on a clock at a particular moment, and who is no longer sure whether the pattern was always there or whether he has made it through the act of looking. The exit sign at the back of the theater cast its red glow across the empty rows. The film was not, by conventional standards, a success, but it caught something true about the experience it described, which is the experience of having a number become the lens through which everything else is suddenly visible, and through which nothing can quite be seen without it. The audience who came to the film as believers in the 23 enigma left it satisfied. The audience who came as skeptics left it confirmed in their skepticism. The audience who came simply as filmgoers, which was likely the smallest of the three groups given the film's limited commercial appeal, left with something less categorizable, a residue of the film's central feeling, which is the feeling of a world that is full of patterns and that will not say whether those patterns mean anything. This is where probability becomes useful, or at least clarifying. a standard statistics textbook, the kind used in introductory courses at universities and found in second-hand shops with the spines cracked at the chapters students actually read, contains within its pages a discussion of what is sometimes called the birthday problem. The birthday problem asks how many people need to be in a room before the probability that two of them share a birthday rises above 50%. The answer, which surprises most people when they first encounter it, is 23. In a group of 23 people, there is a better than even chance that two of them were born on the same day of the same month. The reason most people find this counterintuitive is that they calculate the probability by thinking about their own birthday, imagining how many people would be needed before someone shared it specifically. But the birthday problem is not about any particular birthday. It is about any match among all possible pairs, and the number of possible pairs in a group grows very much faster than the group itself. 23 people produce 253 pairs, and across 253 pairs, the probability of at least one match is high. The student who wrote the number 23 in the margin of the textbook at the point where the birthday problem solution appeared, and who circled it in red with what appears to be mild deflation, the circle has a quality of slight slackening, as though drawn by a hand whose enthusiasm was ebbing as the pen completed its arc, understood something about the number that the 23 Enigma enthusiasts also understood, though they reached a different conclusion from the same understanding. The number is genuinely remarkable. It appears at the solution to a real and interesting mathematical puzzle. It is a prime. It corresponds to the human chromosome pair count. It is not rare enough to be absent from ordinary life, and it is not common enough to be invisible. It sits in a range where it appears regularly, but not constantly, which is exactly the range in which a number becomes a viable focal point for a mind that has been oriented toward it. The cognitive scientists who have studied the 23 Enigma tend to reach for a small set of well-established concepts when explaining how a single anecdote told in a harbor city by a man with a particular gift for observation became a self-sustaining cultural phenomena across 6 decades. Confirmation bias is the central mechanism. A person who has been told to look for something will find it, not because they are being dishonest, but because the filtering system that determines what the mind registers and what it allows to pass unnoticed is highly sensitive to whatever has been recently flagged as significant. A person who learns that a number is meaningful will encounter that number in the world and note it. They will not note with equal weight the dozens of other numbers they encounter in the same day that do not match. The record that builds up in memory over time is therefore not an accurate record of how often the number appears. It is a record of how often it appeared, and the mind was paying attention, which is a different thing entirely. The social dimension of the phenomenon matters too. The 23 Enigma did not spread because people were systematically looking for it in isolation. It spread because the story was interesting, and interesting stories travel. A person who heard the Burroughs Harbor story from a friend began noticing 23 in their own life and mentioned it to another friend, who began noticing it in theirs. Each cycle of telling added new instances to the catalog. Each new instance made the catalog larger and more convincing. The thing fed itself, and the people feeding it were not being credulous or careless. They were doing exactly what human minds do with stories they find compelling. They were fitting their own experience into the story's shape. The 23 Enigma also benefited from the specific qualities that Robert Anton Wilson brought to it when he embedded it in the Illuminatus trilogy. Wilson was not a propagandist for the number. He was, if anything, a propagandist for the experience of being unable to determine whether a pattern is real, which is a more interesting and more durable position. A person who reads Wilson's treatment of 23 does not come away convinced that the number is cosmically significant. They come away convinced that the question of whether the number is cosmically significant is worth sitting with, and sitting with that question is sufficient to begin the process of noticing. Once noticing begins, the number is everywhere, and being everywhere, it generates more noticing, and the circle, like the one Burroughs drew in his notebook at the harbor table, closes on itself. The Boards of Canada track sits in this particular space very comfortably. It does not argue for the significance of 23 degrees north, 82 degrees west. It places the coordinates in a musical context that encourages open, associative attention, and then it plays. Whatever the listener brings to the coordinates, the music will accommodate. The number is there, in the title, available to mean whatever the listener's orientation makes it mean. For some, it is a point on a map. For others, it is another bead on a long and curving string. The string itself is not nothing. It is a real cultural object, assembled over 60 years by many hands, and the fact that its individual components do not, on examination, constitute evidence of a cosmological significance for the number 23 does not make the string uninteresting. It makes it interesting in a different way. It is a record of how a story moves, of how attention can be shaped and sustained and passed from person to person across decades, of how a number can become a vessel for something that is not really about numbers at all, but about the pleasure of finding a pattern, the comfort of believing that the world has a structure that can be perceived if the attention is properly directed, the strange satisfaction of the circle drawn in ink around a figure that seems to keep returning. It should be said that 23 has no particular emotional hold on the numbers around it. 22 is a prime's neighbor. 24 is highly composite, divisible by 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 8, 12, and 24, a number so factorable that it appears throughout measurement systems, in musical theory, and culinary convention. 25 is 5 squared. None of these numbers have developed the cultural weight that 23 carries, and the reason they haven't is not that 23 is inherently more special. It is that 23 was the number Burroughs wrote down at the harbor table, the number that was attached to the flight report on the radio the same evening, the number that Wilson found interesting enough to build a structure around. A different number in that position might have developed the same kind of following. It might, if the story had gone differently, if the captain's record had been 19 years, if the flight had been designated differently, have been 19 that gathered the long attention. But it was 23, and 23 is what the catalog has been maintained around ever since. There is a word for what happens when a person has just learned something new and then begins seeing it everywhere. The word was given its current name by a Stanford linguist, and the experience itself is common enough that most people, on hearing it described, recognize it immediately from their own lives. The experience works like this. A person encounters something they have never consciously noticed before, a word, a make of car, a particular style of window frame, and then, within days or even hours, begins seeing that thing with what seems like remarkable frequency. A word they had never encountered is suddenly in 2 newspaper articles on the same day. A car they had not known existed is suddenly visible on every 3rd street. The frequency feels like evidence that the thing has become more common since they learned about it, but the thing's actual frequency has not changed at all. What has changed is the filtering. What was previously allowed to pass through unrecorded is now being noted. The world has not changed. The attention has. The 23 enigma is this experience at cultural scale. It is what happens when a large number of people apply the same selective attention to the same number across a long enough period of time with the assistance of writers and filmmakers and musicians who have found the experience worth documenting and extending. The result is a genuine cultural phenomenon, a shared, sustained, collectively maintained pattern of noticing that has been alive for 6 decades and shows no particular sign of exhausting itself. The film, despite its reception, is still watched, the trilogy is still read, the Boards of Canada track still carries its coordinates. The harbor in Tangier is still there, though the tables where the expatriates gathered have long since been rearranged, and the particular afternoon light that came off the water in the early 1960s is the kind of light that cannot be preserved in any archive. What can be preserved is the story of a man writing a number down and drawing a circle around it, and the long winding path that number took through the decades that followed, gathering instances and believers and skeptics and curious onlookers in equal measure, becoming something that could not have been predicted from the moment of its origin. The reader who finds a copy of the Illuminatus trilogy today, the pages thick, the spine cracked, possibly a previous reader's pencil mark still faint in the margins, and who reaches the passages where 23 appears in the text, will face the same small decision that every reader has faced since the trilogy was published. They can note the number and move on, treating it as a piece of the novel's internal mythology, interesting as such and no more. Or they can circle it, mentally or literally, and begin to carry it out of the book and into the world, where it will, with some reliability, begin to appear. The number will be there on a street sign, on a bus, on a receipt, on the clock when they happen to glance at it. Each appearance will feel like a small confirmation of something. The confirmation will not be of anything the number knows. It will be of something the attention does, the quiet, persistent, ancient work of finding shapes in whatever material the world provides. Whether the circling calls the number into being, or whether the number was always there, and the circling simply reveals it, is a question the 23 Enigma has been asking since Burroughs first put pen to paper at a table by the water. It is the kind of question that does not need an answer tonight. It is sufficient to hold it gently, the way a person holds a coin they have been turning over, aware of both sides, in no particular hurry to decide which one is facing up, finding the weight of it in the hand, interesting enough on its own terms, in the particular quiet of a late evening when the water outside is calm and the light is low and there is nowhere else to be. In the archive reading room of the Folklore Society in London, on a shelf that runs along the north wall at approximately shoulder height, there are several dozen cloth-bound volumes whose spines have faded to the same pale brown as old tea. The volumes contain transcribed testimonies collected from British families across the 18th and 19th centuries, accounts recorded in the careful, formal handwriting of collectors who believed that what ordinary people remembered and passed down was worth preserving before it disappeared. The ink inside most of them has faded evenly, unhurried, the way ink fades when no one disturbs it for decades at a time. Some of the entries run to several pages, some are no longer than a paragraph, and scattered through them, in the testimony after testimony of families describing births and deaths and marriages and accidents, are numbers, specific numbers, named with a quiet certainty that suggests the families who reported them had no doubt at all that the numbers meant something. One entry, dated to the 1840s and attributed to a family in the county of Somerset, records that the number 3 had appeared at the birth, the marriage, and the death of 3 successive members of the same household. The entry does not speculate about what this meant. It simply states it, with the patient precision of someone who has repeated the fact many times and knows which parts of it matter. The grandmother was born in the third month. The grandfather died on the third day of the week that year. The eldest son was married on a date that, when added, resolved to a 3. The collector who transcribed the account added a brief note in the margin. Family is in firm agreement on all particulars. What the note does not say, but what is clear enough in the choosing of it, is that the particulars were the point, the specific instances, each one named and preserved, carried forward as evidence of something the family had decided to believe, long before any of them had thought to ask why. The practice of finding numbers in family experience is old enough that it has left traces in records from every culture that kept them. What is less often considered is what the finding requires, not just a number and an event, but someone to notice the connection, someone to remember it, someone to tell it to, and someone else to receive it and consider it worth keeping. That is not a supernatural chain of events. It is a description of how any family story survives. The particulars of this kind of story are numbers. The mechanism is the same one that carries the memory of a grandparent's face forward through generations who never met them. Repetition, warmth, and the particular authority of a voice that speaks as though the thing being said has already been proven. The Bader-Meinhof phenomenon is something most people have experienced without having a name for it. A person hears a word they have never heard before, or notices a make of car they had not previously paid attention to, and within days the word or the car seems to appear everywhere, in conversations, on signs, in passing remarks. Stanford psychologist Arnold Zwicky formally named this frequency illusion in 2006, identifying it as the product of two processes operating together. The first is selective attention. Once the mind has registered something as worth noticing, it flags future instances of that thing rather than filtering them out, the way it filters out the hundreds of other details that pass through awareness every minute without leaving a mark. The second is confirmation bias. The mind notes the appearances that confirm the pattern and does not equally note the absences. The number that appeared at a grandmother's birth appears again on a hospital door, and that appearance is recorded. The 1,000 other numbers on the 1,000 other doors are not recorded because they are not the number, and they do not need to be. This is not a design flaw. The brain's capacity to isolate a signal from noise is one of its most useful properties. The ability to notice that a particular type of cloud precedes rain, or that a particular sound in the undergrowth precedes a predator, or that a particular symptom precedes a fever. All of these depend on the same underlying machinery that later, in a quieter context, produces the certainty that a number is following a family. The mechanism does not know the difference between a cloud and a number. It only knows how to do its job, which is to find what has been told to find, and to flag the finding with a small persuasive sense of recognition. The recognition feels like discovery. It feels like the world confirming something. At 3 o'clock in the morning, or in a hospital waiting room, or at the moment when something is changing and the ordinary things feel briefly charged with extra weight, that feeling of confirmation can be a considerable comfort. A young man sitting in a hospital waiting room on a low chair upholstered in a gray fabric that has been worn smooth at the armrests might notice a door across the hall. The door has a number on it. The number is the same one his father mentioned not once but many times, in many contexts, across many years, with the particular emphasis that parents use when they are passing something on, rather than simply saying it. The young man looks at the door. Something moves in his chest. It is quiet and private, and costs him nothing, and what it gives him, in that moment, is a sense that the situation he is in has a shape, that it is not simply chaos, not simply an event happening without structure or precedent, but something continuous with the story his family has been living. He has not been told to feel this. He has been told repeatedly something about a number, and the number is there, and the rest follows without anyone's permission. Psychologist Marshall Duke at Emory University spent a considerable portion of his career studying something he called the intergenerational narrative, the body of stories that a family tells about itself, to itself, across time. His research, developed with colleague Robin Fivish, examined what families knew about their own histories, whether children knew where their grandparents had grown up, what difficulties their parents had faced before the children were born, how the family had handled failure and loss in previous generations. What the research found consistently was that children who had a rich knowledge of their family's narrative showed stronger psychological resilience, a greater capacity to manage difficulty, to locate themselves within a continuing story, rather than experiencing each setback as a new and isolated catastrophe. Duke coined the term the Do You Know scale as a measure of this intergenerational knowledge, and its results were, by the standards of psychological research, unusually consistent. What Duke also found, in the broader texture of the research, was that the specific content of the intergenerational narrative mattered less than its coherence, less than the sense of continuous story it provided. A family that had built its sense of itself around a recurring number, a lucky symbol, a phrase that had passed from generation to generation, was doing something structurally similar to a family that had built its sense of itself around a geographic origin, or a professional tradition, or a shared religious practice. The number in this context is not primarily a number, it is a piece of narrative furniture, something stable and portable that the family can carry with it into unfamiliar rooms and find there a sense of the rooms it has already lived in. The numerological belief, whatever its factual standing, is doing something real. It is creating continuity. It is giving the members of a family something to recognize each other by, across generations that have never met. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is easy to misread what is happening in a family that believes in its number. The belief can look like a category error, like a confusion between counting and meaning, between mathematical fact and personal significance. And in a narrow sense, that is what it is. The number that appeared at a grandmother's birth is not, in any objective sense, connected to the number that appears on a hospital door 3 generations later. But the person who sees the connection is not making a simple mistake. They are doing something more interesting than that. They are maintaining a story. They are performing an act of continuity that places them in a line of people who share something specific, not just blood and genetics and the shape of a jaw, but a particular way of paying attention, a particular thing to watch for, a particular small frisson of recognition that has been handed down like a piece of silverware that no one could quite bring themselves to sell. Anthropologist Barbara Meyerhoff spent time in the 1970s studying a community of elderly Jewish immigrants in Venice, California, men and women who had carried themselves and their memories across enormous distances and losses, and who used their oral histories as a way of preserving a world that no longer physically existed. Her 1978 work, based on that research, paid close attention to the role of numbers in those oral histories. What she noticed was not that the people she spoke with were numerologically obsessed, or that they had constructed formal systems of numerical belief. What she noticed was quieter and more pervasive than that. Numbers appeared in their stories as anchors. It was the 7th year. He died on the same date. We counted 3 days before the letter came. The numbers gave the stories shape. They provided the small structural certainties that made an otherwise chaotic sequence of events feel like a narrative, feel like something that had unfolded according to some principle, even if the principle was never fully articulated. Even if no one could quite say why, 7 was the number that mattered. Meyerhoff called what she was observing a way of creating order within narratives about loss and displacement. The families and communities she documented had experienced histories that were by any measure difficult to hold in the mind without some organizing principle: expulsion, migration, survival, the disappearance of people and places and ways of life. Numbers, in that context, were not superstition in the dismissive sense of the word. They were tools. They were ways of saying, this event and that event are not random. They belong to the same story. They are connected by something we can name, even if we cannot fully explain it. And the act of naming the connection, even a numerical one, even one that would not survive statistical scrutiny, was an act of dignity, a refusal to let the history dissolve into pure contingency. A British Journal of Clinical Psychology case study followed a father and his adult son across a period of therapeutic assessment. The father was a retired military man who had, during his years of service, come to associate the number 7 with luck, or more precisely, with survival. The association had formed during a period of active service in circumstances the case study describes with characteristic clinical restraint as significant threat exposure. The number 7 had appeared in ways the father found difficult to entirely dismiss, at moments when things had gone better than they might have. The association had calcified into something habitual. The father counted in 7s, preferred the 7th item in a sequence, and had, over the years, found himself mildly uneasy when the number was absent from a situation where he felt it should have appeared. What the case study's therapist found, in the initial sessions with the son, was a set of rituals around the number 7 that the son reported as entirely his own, as something he had noticed independently, not something he had been taught. His father, he said, had nothing to do with it. The therapist's notes record this claim with a careful neutrality that is itself informative. The notes do not dispute it. What they do is document the subsequent sessions in which the son, gently and without pressure, began to recall specific conversations, his father counting stairs, his father specifying that 7 minutes of something was a distinct and meaningful duration, his father pausing on the 7th day of each month in a way the son could not fully describe but could clearly remember. The therapist's eventual conclusion was that the number had been transmitted through explicit parental teaching, not in the formal sense of a lesson given and received, but in the informal sense of behavior observed so often and over such a long period that it had become invisible. The son had not been taught to count in 7s. He had grown up watching someone for whom 7 was worth counting, and the watching had been its own kind of teaching. This is how most family beliefs travel, not in the form of formal instruction, but in the form of atmosphere, the accumulated weight of small, repeated, apparently casual references to a thing that is, by the repetition, revealed as not casual at all. A child does not need to be sat down and told that a number matters. A child needs only to notice, across many years, that an adult they love pauses when the number appears, that the pause is different from other pauses, that something in the adult's face shifts in a way that is distinct and particular. Children are, among other things, extraordinarily good readers of adult attention. They notice what adults notice. They learn to notice the same things. And then, having learned to notice them, they cannot easily unlearn it, because the noticing is not a belief they can choose to hold or discard. It has become part of how they see. There is a photograph that a great many families have some version of, taken at a reunion or a holiday or a gathering on the occasion of something that mattered enough to cause everyone to arrange themselves in front of a camera. In the photograph, the family is arranged on the steps of a house, or in a garden, or in a room with a particular quality of afternoon light. They are not thinking about numbers. They are thinking about holding still, or about what expression to wear, or about the relative who always makes the same joke before the shutter clicks. Somewhere in the background of the image, above a door, or printed on a sign visible through a window, or embossed on a gatepost just at the edge of the frame, there is a number, not staged. Simply there, the way numbers are simply there in the world, on every door and every corner and every piece of mail that arrives at every address. 3 of the people in that photograph have mentioned the number in separate conversations with separate family members at separate points in their lives, not because they planned to, not because they were searching for it in the image, because the number was there and they had learned to notice it, and noticing it produced a small, quiet pleasure, the particular pleasure of a pattern recognized, a familiar shape appearing in unfamiliar surroundings, the slight warmth of a thing that belongs to the family, appearing in a place where it was not expected, but is, now that it has appeared, not entirely surprising. The 3 people in the photograph have never compared notes on this. They do not know that the others have felt it too. The belief in this family is not a shared explicit position. It is 3 separate private experiences of the same recognition, circling the same number from 3 different angles, with the photograph sitting in a drawer somewhere, and the number persisting in it, faded and permanent, long after everyone in the image has stopped counting anything. The transmission of a numerological belief from one generation to the next does not require a decision. It does not require anyone to sit in a circle and formally agree that the number means something. What it requires is much more ordinary, the things that family life produces without effort and without plan. A story told at dinner, a pause before a door, a certain kind of smile when the number appears on a receipt or a ticket or the page of a book. The story is told well, which is to say, it is told with the mild, comfortable conviction of someone who is not trying to convince anyone of anything but simply reporting what happened. The child at the table receives it not as an argument to be evaluated, but as information about the world, specifically about the family's world, the particular world the child is being inducted into, the one with its own geography and its own weather and its own recurring shapes. A grandmother at a kitchen table in the early evening, the window dark behind her, the light of a ceiling fixture falling evenly across the table's surface, a cup of tea cooling at her elbow, leans toward a child and says the number, not dramatically, not with the gravity of someone performing a revelation, with the mild emphasis of someone sharing a detail they consider worth knowing, the way they might share the name of a street or the correct pronunciation of a word. The child's face tilts upward to receive it. The child does not question it, because at the age of receiving things from grandmothers at kitchen tables, very little is questioned. The number enters the child's understanding of the world and finds its place there beside everything else the grandmother has said, distinguished from the rest by only one quality, the quality of the pause before it, the quality of the weight the grandmother gave it, which is the same quality the grandmother received it with, from someone who gave it to her the same way, decades before. What gets passed down is not only the number itself, but the manner of its telling, the slight elevation, the sense that this is different from other numbers. The implication, never stated but always present, that the family's relationship to this number is one of the things that makes the family what it is. Children are not passive recipients of family belief. They are active participants in it. They try the belief on. They look for the number. They find it, as the brain will always find what it has been instructed to find, and the finding confirms the instruction, and the instruction deepens, and the cycle continues without anyone having to consciously maintain it. Marshall Duke's research arrived at a conclusion that sounds almost too simple when stated directly. Families that tell their stories to each other do better than families that don't. The content of the stories matters less than the telling. A family that tells a story about a number is doing the same structural work as a family that tells a story about an emigration or a war or a business that failed and was rebuilt. The number is the vehicle. The vehicle carries something that is not about the number at all, something about continuity, about belonging to a line of people, about the particular comfort of having a history that is recognizably yours. The numerological belief is, in this light, not a mistake. It is a tradition, and it functions the way traditions function, by giving people a shared reference point, a thing they can gesture toward when they want to gesture toward the whole family, without having to describe the whole family. This does not mean the number actually follows the family. It means that the family follows the number, that the family has learned to notice it, has built a practice of noticing it, has made the noticing itself a part of what it means to be in the family. The number is not persistent. The attention is persistent, and persistent attention, in a world that contains every number in roughly equal abundance, will always find what it is looking for, because what it is looking for is everywhere, waiting with the patient indifference of a number that does not know it is being watched. There is a quality to the moment when a family story about a number is first received, first heard by the person who will carry it next, that is difficult to characterize precisely, but easy to recognize. It is not wonder, exactly, though wonder is part of it. It is more like orientation. The child or the young adult who receives the story feels something settle into place, a small additional item added to the internal map that tells a person who they are and where they come from and what kind of attention the world requires from them. The number is now part of the map, not a large part, not a dramatic part, but a permanent one. The way details absorbed in early life tend to be permanent, worn into the mind by repetition and by the authority of the voice that delivered them. A therapist's notepad, used in the course of working with the son in the case study, has the number 7 written at the top of a page. Below it, 2 names connected by a line drawn in careful ballpoint. The line does not represent biology. It does not represent a shared gene or a shared diagnosis or any of the other things that lines between names on a clinical notepad sometimes represent. It represents something passed across a dinner table in a story told too well to be forgotten, told in the specific, unhurried way of someone who believes what they are saying and has believed it long enough that the belief has become a form of love, something offered freely to the people at the table as part of the ongoing project of making them feel that they belong to something. The son, by the time the therapist drew that line, had spent his entire adult life inside a belief he did not know he had inherited. He had experienced it as his own, as a private discovery, a personal observation, a quirk of attention that was specifically and only his. That experience was not wrong, exactly. It was his, but it was also transmitted the way most of the things that feel most personal are transmitted from a person who felt them personally to a person who watched them feeling it, to a person who grew up in that atmosphere and breathed it in and made it part of their own interior weather, without registering the moment of transfer, because the moment of transfer had no clear edges, no beginning, and no end, just the long gradual saturation of living in close proximity to someone who cared about a number. The most durable things families pass down are frequently not the things they intend to. The silverware and the photographs and the addresses of family houses. These are intended, catalogued, assigned in wills, discussed in explicit terms. The way a person holds their jaw when they are concentrating, the phrase they reach for when they are not quite complaining, but not quite not complaining either. The particular thing they do when they notice a certain number on a door, or a receipt, or the spine of a book. These arrive without announcement. They are absorbed rather than received. They feel original because there was no ceremony of transmission to mark them as inherited. They are, in a sense, the deepest inheritance, the things that travel not in documents, but in the body, in habit, in the particular shape that a person's attention takes when it is directed at the world. There is a child somewhere, in a house with a specific smell, in a kitchen with a specific quality of evening light, who has not yet heard the story. The number has not been named to them. They do not yet know that it matters, or that it belongs to them, or that it belongs to the family in a way that is distinct from the thousands of other numbers they encounter every day, without a second thought. The grandmother is still deciding how to begin. Not consciously. She is simply living, moving around the kitchen, setting the cup down in its accustomed place, aware that the child is at the table, and that the evening is settling, and that some things are worth saying when the light is right, and there is enough time to say them properly. The number is there, in her. It has been there for decades, since the evening she received it herself, from someone who is now gone, in a kitchen that no longer exists. She carries it without effort. It is simply part of how she is. The child is looking at the table. The grandmother settles into her chair. Outside the window, the evening is doing what evenings do, darkening by degrees, the light going slowly from gold to gray, the sounds of the neighborhood muffling one by one into the particular quiet of a weekday settling toward night. The grandmother sets down her cup. She says something, not the number yet, something before it, the gentle preamble that gives a thing its context, the few sentences that tell the child this is a different kind of conversation from the ones that don't stay. The child's face shifts, still, attentive, tilted slightly upward in the lamplight, and then the grandmother says the number, and the number enters the child and takes its place and begins its patient wait for the next time it appears. It will appear. It appears everywhere. When you know to look, the child will look. And years from now, in some kitchen or waiting room or ordinary moment, when the light is falling at a particular angle, the child will see it and feel the specific, quiet, unmistakable warmth of a thing that belongs to them. A thing that came from somewhere, from someone, from a cup of tea cooling at an elbow in an evening that has long since passed into the permanent dark. The number will be there. The child, by then no longer a child, will carry it forward, not because they decided to, because that is what family stories do. They tuck themselves somewhere behind the eyes, in the part of a person that is still sitting at that kitchen table, still listening, still receiving the particular weight of a number that someone who loved them decided long ago was worth the telling. A clay tablet pressed somewhere in what is now southern Iraq carries the earliest version of a number that would outlast the city that made it, the language that named it, and every astronomer who ever studied the sky above that rooftop. The tablet is small enough to hold in both hands. Its surface is pressed with wedge-shaped marks that record, among other things, the count of visible lights that move through the night sky, the ones that do not hold still the way the stars do, the ones that wander. The count is 7. It was always 7. The Mesopotamian scribes who pressed that count into wet clay sometime in the 3rd millennium before the Common Era were not inventing a sacred number. They were writing down what they saw. 7 planets were visible from that rooftop with the naked eye: the Sun, the Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. The week, the 7-day cycle that still organizes modern calendars, that still divides working time from rest, emerged from this count. It was not chosen arbitrarily. It was observed. A civilization looked at the sky with careful eyes, counted what moved, and arranged time around the answer. The number 7 did not enter Mesopotamian cosmology as a symbol first and a count second. It entered as a fact, and only afterward accumulated everything else that centuries of use could carry. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest extended narratives that survives from any culture, describes the underworld as a place entered through 7 gates. At each gate, the goddess Inanna surrenders one of her garments or ornaments, descending through 7 thresholds into a realm where, the text says, all laws are the same. 7 gates, 7 surrenders, 7 boundaries between the living world and the one below it. The poem is generally dated to approximately 2100 BCE in its earliest written form, though the oral traditions behind it are likely older. Whatever shaped the decision to place 7 gates in the underworld, the structural echo of 7 celestial bodies in 7 underworld thresholds is clear enough that scholars have been noting it for well over a century. The number that counted the sky also counted the depth. This was not unusual. Across the civilizations of the ancient Near East, the number 7 appears as a load-bearing element in cosmological structures, not decorative, not accidental, but structural. It was the number of days between one phase of the moon and the next. It was the count of the world's visible celestial travelers. Once it was established as a measure of cosmic order, it became the number that felt most like order itself. And applying it to other structures, the gates of the underworld, the years of a drought, the measures of a ceremony, was not superstition so much as it was consistency. A civilization with one organizing principle tends to apply that principle broadly. In Judaic tradition, the 7-day structure of time is embedded so deeply that separating it from the religion's foundational texts would require dismantling the texts themselves. The account of creation in Genesis distributes the work of making the world across 6 days and designates the 7th as rest. The Sabbath is not an afterthought. The Sabbath is the reason the count runs to 7. Rest is the completion, not the interruption. Every 7 years, in the law set out in Leviticus, the land itself was to rest, crops left unplanted, debts released, the soil allowed to lie fallow. This was called the sabbatical year, and the word sabbatical, which now mostly describes a period of academic leave, carries that older meaning inside it, like a seed inside a hull. After 7 cycles of 7 years, 49 years, came the Jubilee, a year in which property reverted to its original owners, and those who had been enslaved were freed. The menorah, the 7-branched lampstand central to Jewish ritual life, carries the same count in its form: 6 arms extending from a central shaft, 7 flames in total, one number present at the beginning of time, at the measure of the land, and at the center of the temple. Consistently 7. Always 7. It is worth sitting with the particular quality of that consistency. 7 was not chosen for these structures, because a committee of priests found it pleasing. 7 arrived through observation, embedded itself in the organization of time, and then found its way into the structure of covenant and ceremony because it was already the number that described cosmic regularity. The week was already 7 days before the religious significance of the Sabbath was established. The number arrived with its credentials already in order. The ancient world's relationship with number was not purely observational, though. Alongside the civilizations that found sacred numbers by watching the sky, there were thinkers who proposed that the numbers themselves were the reason for everything observable, that looking at the sky was not the right direction because the numbers were underneath the sky, and the sky was just one of the many things numbers had decided to produce. Pythagoras of Samos, born on the Aegean island of Samos in the 6th century BCE, founded a philosophical and religious community at Croton, a Greek colonial city in the toe of the Italian peninsula, whose central teaching was that numbers were not descriptions of reality, but the substance of it, not symbols, not measurements, the actual ontological basis of everything that existed. The community Pythagoras gathered at Croton lived by this doctrine with the seriousness of people who believed it completely. They were vegetarians, or at least abstained from certain foods, with beans appearing on the list of prohibited items for reasons that sources do not fully agree on. They observed periods of silence. They regarded their mathematical and philosophical discoveries as religious revelation rather than intellectual achievement. A theorem about the relationship between the sides of a right triangle was not, for a Pythagorean, a useful tool. It was evidence of how number had constructed space. In Pythagorean doctrine, each number carried specific qualities that were not assigned to it arbitrarily, but were discovered through the number's behavior in mathematical operations. The number 1 was the source and origin of all numbers, not itself a number in the way the others were, but the principle from which number arose. 2 was the first even number, and carried the quality of the female principle, divisible, open, receptive. 3 was the first odd number after 1, and carried the quality of the male principle, indivisible at its center, complete. 4 was the number of justice, a perfect square, equally balanced, the number that described fairness by the evenness of its construction. Pythagoras is reported to have said that justice is 4, not that 4 represents justice, but that justice is the number 4 expressed in human affairs. The most sacred number in Pythagorean cosmology was 10. 10 was called the tetractys, the sacred triangle, because it was the sum of the first 4 numbers, 1, 2, 3, and 4, added together produced 10. In Pythagorean practice, the tetractys was arranged as a triangular formation of dots, 1 dot at the apex, 2 in the second row, 3 in the third, 4 in the base. 10 points arranged in a perfect triangle. The Pythagoreans reportedly swore their oaths by this figure, invoking it as they might invoke a deity, by the one who gave our soul the tetractys, which contains the source and root of eternal nature. Whether or not those exact words were used in that exact form, ancient sources vary. The reverence that Pythagorean communities held for this triangular arrangement of 10 is well documented. They believed, apparently without irony, that the whole of creation was held together by a number you could represent with 10 dots in a triangle. The community Pythagoras built at Croton was eventually destroyed in a political upheaval sometime in the 5th century BCE, its members scattered, its buildings burned according to some accounts. But the doctrine that numbers underlie existence did not die with the community. It moved through Plato, who absorbed Pythagorean thinking into his own cosmology, and described the forms behind physical reality in mathematical terms. It moved through the Islamic scholars of the medieval period, who preserved and extended Greek mathematical philosophy. It arrived in modified forms in every tradition that has tried to describe the structure of what exists and reached for number as the most reliable language available. The building at Croton, where the Pythagoreans gathered, no longer stands. The exact proportions in which its rooms were arranged are not recorded, though it is pleasant to imagine that a community so devoted to numerical ratios would have built their walls and corridors according to the same principles they believed governed the cosmos. The marble floors are gone. The doctrine of the Tetractys is mostly an artifact of intellectual history now, studied by scholars of pre-Socratic philosophy rather than practiced by communities of believers. But the intuition behind it, that number is not merely descriptive, but is somehow constitutive of what is real, has never fully left the places it settled. The fear of 13 is one of the most institutionalized number beliefs in the contemporary Western world, and it arrived where it is now without a single decisive origin story. What most accounts agree on is that the association between 13 and misfortune is old and layered, built from several independent sources that reinforced each other over centuries until the belief became self-sustaining. One account traces the fear to the Last Supper, where 13 people were gathered at the table. Another traces it to Norse mythology, where the trickster Loki, the 13th guest at a divine feast in Valhalla, caused the death of the beloved god Bald. A third source traces it simply to the structural awkwardness of 13's position after 12, which is a number of remarkable organizational usefulness. 12 months in a year, 12 hours on a clock face, 12 members in a jury, 12 apostles, 12 signs of the zodiac, 12 inches in a foot. After 12, which divides into so many useful portions, 13 sits without partners. It cannot be divided in half, in thirds, or in quarters without leaving fractions. It is the first prime after 12. It is simply inconvenient. Whether the fear of 13 began in theology, mythology, or arithmetic, by the modern period it was sufficiently established to have its own clinical name, triskaidekaphobia. The word is Greek in construction, triskaideka meaning 13, phobia meaning fear, assembled in the 19th century to label what had become a documented and apparently common anxiety. A 2002 study by the Otis Elevator Company examined elevator panels across a range of American buildings and found that approximately 85% of the panels examined omitted the button for the 13th floor entirely. The floor exists, of course. The building does not stop at 12 and resume at 14. The floor numbered 14 in the elevator is the 13th floor by count. Everyone who works in or visits such buildings is likely aware of this. The omission is not a practical measure against superstition. It is a social gesture toward the comfort of those who hold the belief, offered at low cost by those who do not. The button is removed, the floor is renamed, and the building continues to stand on its actual number of stories without consulting its elevator panel about the matter. The economic dimension of this belief is perhaps the most striking part of it, because economics measures behavior rather than opinion. Studies of business activity in the United States have estimated that Friday the 13th, the intersection of the unlucky number with an unlucky day of the week, the two negative associations compounding each other, costs between $800 million and $900 million annually in reduced business activity. People postpone decisions, they cancel travel, they delay signings and launches and openings. They do this not necessarily because they believe with great conviction that the day is dangerous, but because the association is present enough in their minds to make caution feel reasonable at low cost. The sum of many small, individually minor deferrals, a flight rebooked, a contract pushed to Monday, a grand opening moved to the 15th, amounts across a country the size of the United States to a figure that sits in the nine-figure range. That is not a figure produced by mass delusion. It is produced by a widely shared residual association between a number and misfortune, operating at the level of mild preference rather than fixed belief, distributed across millions of people who would each individually say they were not superstitious. The number sits in the elevator panel with its quiet absence, 14 where 13 should be, the sequence moving on without acknowledgement. No alarm sounds, no one comments. The gap is simply accepted, the same way most gaps are accepted, by agreeing, without discussion, not to look directly at the space. On the other side of the world, from the Pythagorean community at Croton, on the other side of the calendar, from the Mesopotamian scribes, who counted 7 planets, the number 4 developed an entirely different reputation. In Chinese culture, 4 is the number that people prefer not to say aloud, and the reason is phonological rather than theological or mathematical. The Mandarin word for 4, si, sounds, to ears familiar with both words, similar to the Mandarin word for death, si. The tones are different. 4 is spoken with a falling tone, death with a falling rising tone, but the consonant and vowel sounds are close enough that the proximity produces discomfort. Linguists call this phenomenon homophonic taboo, the avoidance of a word, or in this case, a number, because of its sound-based resemblance to something considered harmful or dangerous to invoke. It is a category of avoidance behavior observed across many languages and cultures, operating at the level of sound rather than meaning. The consequence of this association is a numerological architecture in Chinese urban life that mirrors in its practical expression what the fear of 13 produces in American elevator panels. In many buildings in China and in Chinese communities in other countries, the 4th floor is omitted from elevator listings or renumbered. In some buildings, any floor containing the digit 4, 14, 24, 40, 44 is absent from the panel. Hospitals, where the proximity of death is most acutely felt, are particularly likely to omit 4th floors. Real estate in Chinese markets shows a measurable price difference between apartments on floors or with address numbers containing 4 compared to those with other numbers. The discount is real, it is measurable, it is produced entirely by the similarity of 2 spoken syllables, one of which a civilization decided at some point in its long history was better not to dwell on. 8, in the same cultural context, is the most fortunate number available. The Mandarin word for 8, ba, sounds similar to the word for prosperity or fortune, fa. The tones and full pronunciations are distinct, but the resemblance is close enough that the association has become one of the most robust numerological beliefs in Chinese cultural life. License plates containing multiple 8s are sold at premium prices. Phone numbers with strings of 8s are more expensive. An address with several 8s in it is considered desirable in a way that has measurable effects on property values. A study of license plate auctions found that plates composed of repeated 8s sold for multiples of their standard value. The association is not held privately as a personal belief. It is publicly expressed in economic behavior, built into pricing structures, embedded in the decisions of developers and government officials and individuals arranging the details of their lives. The 2008 Beijing Olympics opened on the evening of August 8, 2008. The ceremony began at 8 minutes past 8 in the evening. The date was written as August 8th, 08, the time as 8:08. The whole moment constructed so that the most auspicious digit available in Chinese numerology would appear at the commencement of the largest public event, China had hosted in its modern history. The decision was made deliberately, openly, without apology. The stadium filled with tens of thousands of performers and spectators, their movements synchronized to an extraordinary degree, the sky above Beijing full of fireworks and light. The clock read 8:08, and a civilization of more than 1 billion people had arranged their largest ceremony around the properties of a sound that a spoken number shared with a spoken word for good fortune. The stadium is still there. The opening ceremony is still documented in video recordings that anyone with an internet connection can find. The number is built into the record of the event at the level of the date and the minute hand, and it will remain there for as long as records of the 2008 Olympics are kept. Future historians examining the event will find the timing was not accidental because no one involved intended it to look accidental. The number was chosen as openly as the architects chose the shape of the Bird's Nest Stadium that housed the ceremony. A number's meaning was used as a material, the way stone and steel are materials, to build something that a civilization wanted to be auspicious. What all of these examples share, the 7 planets over Mesopotamia, the Pythagorean tetractys at Croton, the absent 13 on the elevator panel, the celebrated 80s of Beijing, is not irrationality. It is something older than rationality as a category. Before the distinction between number as fact and number as symbol was drawn, before science and religion occupied separate territories in human thought, number was both of those things simultaneously. It measured and it meant. It counted the planets and named the days and described the proportion of a temple and guaranteed the justice of a judgment, all at once in the same act, without any felt contradiction. The separation of those functions, the counting function from the meaning function, is a relatively recent development in the history of the human mind, and it has never been complete. The elevator panel, with its missing 13, is not a relic of a pre-scientific age. It was manufactured and installed in buildings designed by engineers who used calculus and structural mechanics. The gap exists inside an entirely rational building because the people who commissioned the building understood that human beings are not entirely rational buildings themselves, and that a small accommodation costs very little and offends no one. The Pythagorean community at Croton believed that 10 dots arranged in a triangle held the secret of eternal nature. They swore their most serious oaths by this figure. They were also simultaneously among the most rigorous mathematical thinkers of their era. The same minds that believed 4 was justice and 10 was the cosmos also developed theorems about musical intervals, figured out the relationship between a vibrating string's length and the pitch it produces, and contributed, in ways still visible in contemporary mathematics, to the foundations of a discipline that eventually produced the tools to describe the large-scale structure of the observable universe. The number beliefs and the mathematical achievements did not exist in spite of each other. They existed inside the same minds at the same time, fed by the same conviction that number was the most important thing in the world to understand. In medieval Europe, numbers were organized into a cosmological hierarchy that drew on Greek philosophy, Jewish scriptural tradition, and Christian theology simultaneously, producing a numerological system of considerable complexity that structured architecture, music, and natural philosophy alike. The number 3 expressed the Trinity and governed the organization of the heavens into 3 spheres. The number 4 expressed the 4 elements and the 4 humors. 7 combined them and governed the known planets, and the days of the week, and the deadly sins, and the virtues required to counter them. 12 organized the apostles, the months and the signs of the zodiac into a single structure. These were not decorative correspondences. Medieval scholars treated them as evidence that creation had been made according to a plan that number could reveal, and the plan was consistent enough to be read in music, in the motions of the planets, and in the proportions of a cathedral's nave with equal confidence. The cathedrals of the medieval period are in some ways the most visible surviving evidence of this belief in the structural meaning of number. The proportions of Chartres Cathedral, for instance, have been analyzed by scholars of sacred geometry who argue that its major dimensions embody specific numerical and geometric relationships that were placed there deliberately, as theological statements made in stone. Not everyone who has examined Chartres agrees on which relationships are intentional and which are the natural consequences of building within the constraints of available materials and practical engineering. The debate is, in its way, a version of the same question that runs through all of this. When a number appears with apparent significance, when the proportions seem to correspond, and the counts align, how much of the pattern was placed there by the builders, and how much was found there by the scholars who came afterward and brought their own knowledge of what to look for. Chartres still stands, its nave still running to its particular length, its west facade still facing the morning light. The numbers are in the stone, whether or not every relationship the sacred geometers find. There was intended by the medieval masons who cut the blocks. The cathedral predates the ability to resolve that question definitively and will likely continue to stand past the point at which anyone is still trying to resolve it. The Aztec calendar system assigned numerical and sacred significance to specific days in a structure of interlocking cycles that created a 365-day solar calendar and a 260-day ritual calendar, the two running simultaneously like two cogs of different sizes, their alignment cycling through a period of approximately 52 years before returning to the same configuration. The point at which the two cycles completed their alignment simultaneously was a moment of profound cosmic significance in Aztec belief, a moment at which, according to the cosmological tradition, the gods might or might not decide to continue the present age of the world. Ceremonies were conducted to ensure the sun would rise again, fires were extinguished and relit. The 52-year period was watched with the kind of attentiveness that only systems that have been refined across generations can sustain. This was not casual numerology. It was meticulous, institutionalized, and built into the architecture of civic and religious life at every level. A civilization's relationship with number, when it runs deep enough, produces not just beliefs, but entire systems of timekeeping, architecture, music, agriculture, and governance, organized around the properties of specific counts and sequences. The Mayan long count calendar, which organized time and cycles ending at what scholars compute was approximately December of 2012 in the Gregorian calendar, generated a significant amount of discussion in the early 21st century about whether its end marked a predicted apocalypse. The Mayan calendar did not, according to scholars who study it, describe the end of the world at that date. It described the end of a cycle and the beginning of the next one, which is precisely what calendars do, at the scale appropriate to their units. But the proximity of a large calendrical endpoint to anxieties current in the early 21st century was sufficient to sustain a wide and lively popular interpretation that the Mayan calendar was predicting something dramatic. The calendar did not oblige. In the Jewish mystical tradition of Kabbalah, the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet are each assigned a numerical value through a system called gematria, which finds the hidden numerical equivalences between words whose letter values sum to the same total. The word for life Shy has a numerical value of 18, which is why gifts of money in multiples of 18 are considered auspicious in Jewish custom. The word for love, ahava, has a value of 13, which sits in interesting tension with the Western cultural association of 13 with misfortune, since in Kabbalistic numerology, the same number describes love, and in a different traditional count, the attributes of divine mercy. Numbers mean differently in different systems. The same digit that one tradition avoids, another treats as the numerical expression of something essential and good. The number 13 does not have a fixed meaning across all contexts. What it has is a fixed form, and the meanings are assigned to that form by the systems that receive it. This multiplicity of meanings attached to the same digits is itself worth noticing. 4 is deeply unlucky in Chinese cultural belief and entirely neutral or even architecturally significant in other traditions. 13 is avoided in American buildings and represents divine mercy in one strand of Jewish mysticism. 7 is a number of completeness and rest in Abrahamic traditions, a count of celestial bodies in Mesopotamian cosmology, and a number with no particular spiritual significance in many other cultural systems. The digits are the same everywhere. The meanings are locally assembled, historically built up, culturally transmitted, and held with varying degrees of conviction by the people who inherit them. What travels across all of these traditions is not the meaning of any specific number, but the behavior, the reaching for number as a way of describing what is most important, most dangerous, most auspicious, or most real. A Babylonian priest counting planets from a ziggurat roof in the 3rd millennium BCE, and an economist calculating the annual cost of Friday the 13th avoidance in the United States are not doing the same thing, and treating them as equivalent would flatten important distinctions. But they are doing something that shares a recognizable family resemblance, visible across the considerable distance between them. Both are taking a number seriously. Both are treating a count as something that carries meaning beyond the count itself. The priest believed the sky had been arranged in sevens because sevens were significant. The economist is measuring the aggregate of 1 billion individual decisions, each one made by a person who, on some level, treats the coincidence of a day and a number as carrying information about what is wise and what is unwise to do that day. In a contemporary American office building, an elevator rises through floors that are numbered in a sequence everyone in the building understands is not complete. The button for 12 gives way to the button for 14. The space where 13 would have been is occupied by nothing, by the metal of the panel, smooth and undifferentiated, offering no button to press. The people who ride that elevator every working day know that the 14th floor is the 13th floor they have always known. The building's engineers knew it when they drew the plans. The contractors who installed the elevator panel knew it when they removed the button. Nobody decided that pretending the 13th floor does not exist would make the building safer, or that the gap in the numbering would protect its occupants from anything they might otherwise encounter on a floor called 13. What the building chose instead was a kind of courtesy, an acknowledgement that the number carries, for some of the people who would use this elevator, a residue of old association that is not easily reasoned away, and that accommodating the association costs little and honors something. The gap in the sequence is not a capitulation to irrationality. It is a small piece of evidence that the people who commissioned this building understood human beings to be, among other things, creatures that have been living with number for a very long time, and that the living has left marks. The elevator door opens on 14, the corridor stretches away, The number 13 sits in its absence, present in the way omissions are present, felt along the edges, recognized by the shape of the space around it, confirmed by the fact that everyone who steps out of that elevator and walks that corridor knows, without needing to be told, exactly which floor they are standing on. The oldest human habit visible in that small gap is not, in the end, fear. It is something that resembles, at its center, the same impulse that pressed 7 into a clay tablet above the plain of Mesopotamia and arranged 10 dots in a triangle on the marble floor of a school in Croton. The desire to believe that numbers know something, that the count of a thing, if attended to carefully enough, might reveal something about the nature of what has been counted, that the sky full of moving lights is organized, and that the organization means something, and that the something is available to whoever is patient enough and attentive enough to count. The tablet is in a museum now. The school at Croton is gone. The elevator panel stands in its building with its quiet gap, and the people who ride past the absent 13 on their way to work carry, without necessarily knowing they carry it, the long tale of every civilization that ever looked at a number and felt, for reasons that turned out to be difficult to argue away, that the number was looking back. In the space behind closed eyes, where the room is still perceptible but beginning to lose its edges, shapes appear without invitation. They are not quite images. They are not quite nothing. A spiral unfolds from a point of dim light, rotates through several slow degrees, and is replaced by another. A line of numerals drifts from one side of the dark to the other, unhurried, purposeless, casting no shadow. This is the hypnagogic state, not sleep, not waking, but the narrow corridor between them, and in this state, the visual cortex, freed from the task of processing the world, produces its own quiet content from within. It has been doing this every night for as long as there have been people lying in the dark. The shapes that appear in this corridor are not random in the way that term is usually meant. They are not chaotic or distressing. Research published across several journals, including Dreaming and Consciousness and Cognition, has documented that hypnagogic imagery tends toward particular forms, geometric patterns that repeat and evolve, cascades of numerals, symbols that cycle through the field of vision with the unhurried patience of something that knows it will be observed. The visual cortex neurons responsible for these images are simply firing in the absence of their usual input, the way a string instrument produces a low resonant hum when the air pressure in a room changes and no one has touched it. The instrument does not require a player. The brain does not require a reason. The shapes appear because appearing is what the system does when the day has been set aside. A number that was noticed that afternoon, on a receipt, on a door, on the spine of a book left open on a table, may surface here among the spirals, not because it carries meaning, but because it carries charge. Matthew Walker, who studies sleep at the University of California, Berkeley, has described REM sleep as a form of overnight therapy. What he means by this is specific and demonstrable. During REM sleep, the brain processes emotionally tagged memories, the events and encounters of the day that arrived carrying some weight, however small, and it does something particular with them. It separates the emotional charge from the memory content. The memory is kept. The weight it carried is gently removed. Walker's research has shown this process in measurable detail. The neurochemical environment of REM sleep is distinct from that of waking, low in norepinephrine, the compound most associated with stress responses, which appears to allow the brain to revisit charged material without re-experiencing the charge at full intensity. What this means for a number that has been noticed is worth sitting with slowly. If a number is encountered at a moment that carries feeling, the address of a hospital where someone is waiting for news, the date on a letter that changes something, the number on the door of a room where a conversation happened that will take time to understand. That number arrives in memory with an emotional tag attached. The tag says, "This one matters. Pay attention to this one." And the sleeping brain, sorting through the day's accumulated material with the patient diligence of something that has been doing this work for a very long time, will find that tag. It will find the number. And by the time the morning comes, the memory of the number will have been consolidated, woven more firmly into the fabric of what the brain considers significant, while the specific emotional urgency of the original moment will have been softened. The number is kept, the weight is redistributed, and in the morning, the number feels important in a way that is quieter and more settled than the feeling of the day before. This is not a malfunction. It is the sleeping brain doing exactly what it was built to do. The default mode network is a set of brain regions that were first described comprehensively by Marcus Reichel and colleagues at Washington University in a 2001 paper that changed the way neuroscientists thought about what the brain is doing when it appears to be doing nothing. Before that paper, the resting brain was largely treated as a system in standby, quiescent, waiting for the next task, holding its place. What Reichel's team found was that the regions now called the default mode network were significantly more active during rest and mind wandering than during directed, externally focused tasks. The brain is not in standby when it is left to itself. It is working. It is building. What the default mode network builds, researchers now understand, are self-narratives. In the quiet before sleep, with the room dark and the day receding, the default mode network draws connections between events, constructs sequences, assembles the scattered moments of a life into something that has the shape of a story. It does this without instruction and without oversight. The pre-sleep mind is not a passive space waiting to be filled by dreams. It is an active, story-building architecture that has been running continuously since waking, and in the last quiet minutes before sleep takes over completely, it tends to do some of its most coherent work. A number that has appeared across several days, or several years, or several decades of family history arrives in this narrative-building space with something of a head start. It has already been noticed. It has already been assigned significance, however lightly. It has the particular quality of something that has been mentioned before, which gives it the distinct texture of something worth mentioning again. And so the default mode network, assembling its nightly construction of self and story in the quiet of a darkened room, may reach for that number the way a composer returns to a motif, not because the music requires it structurally, but because it has already shown that it fits. The number settles into the narrative. The narrative accommodates it. Neither is disturbed by the arrangement. Alison Harvey, a researcher at Oxford University, published work in behavior research and therapy, examining what she called pre-sleep cognitive arousal. The condition she was describing is recognizable to anyone who has lain in a dark room while the mind continued, uninstructed, to move from thought to thought with a restless, low-grade energy that does not feel like thinking, but also does not feel like rest. Harvey found that this kind of pre-sleep mental activity is strongly associated with a particular orientation of the mind, threat detection. The mind that cannot settle is often the mind that is, without quite being aware of it, scanning, looking for patterns, trying to identify what needs attention before the lights go fully out. This is an old system. It runs beneath the layer of deliberate thought. In the anxious pre-sleep state, a number that has gathered significance over time becomes a natural focal point. The scanning mind finds it easily because it has already been marked. It examines it from several angles with the particular, slightly exhausting thoroughness of a mind that has decided something is important and is now making sure it has not missed anything about it. The number grows in the attention paid to it. It acquires small satellites of association, the moments it appeared, the feelings those moments carried, the connections the mind has been making between them. By the time sleep arrives, the number has been turned over so thoroughly that it sits near the surface of the sleeping mind, like an object left close to the edge of a shelf. It will likely appear in the night. In some form, at some depth of the dreaming, it will be there. A survey study of dream content, published in the International Journal of Dream Research, found something that is, in the context of everything else, both logical and quietly interesting. Participants who described themselves as superstitious or spiritually oriented were significantly more likely to report that specific numbers appearing in their dreams felt meaningful. They were also significantly more likely to carry that sense of meaning forward into their waking day. The number arrived in the dream, carrying weight. It left the dream still carrying it, and in waking, it seemed to confirm itself. The number had appeared in the dream, and then, because attention had been primed, it appeared again in waking life, on a car registration plate, in a telephone number, in the page count of a document, and each appearance felt like the continuation of something the dream had begun. The loop between sleeping and waking cognition, it turns out, runs in both directions. What a person believes numbers to be capable of shapes what numbers are noticed in sleep. What is noticed in sleep shapes what is looked for in the day. What is found in the day is carried back into the next night's pre-sleep narrative. The system feeds itself not through any external force or hidden code embedded in the world, but through the ordinary, well-documented mechanics of a brain that is very good at finding what it has decided to find. This is not a criticism of the finding, it is a description of how finding works. On a winter night, in a house that has been quiet for several hours, a person lies in the hypnagogic corridor, with the room faintly visible around them, the outline of a door, the soft weight of a blanket, the distant sound of a street that is not quite asleep either. Behind their closed eyes, the visual cortex is generating its slow, unhurried content, a geometric form, a cascade of shapes, a number perhaps drifting through the field without urgency, the way a word surfaces sometimes in the moment before sleep takes hold and is gone before it can be examined. The number does not demand anything, it does not announce itself, it simply appears, as numbers do, in the place where the brain keeps things it considers worth keeping. If the number is familiar, if it is a number that has accompanied this family across a generation or two, a number that was first mentioned at a kitchen table by someone who is no longer living, a number that has been noticed in significant places often enough to have earned its place in the family's inner catalog, then its appearance in the hypnagogic dark carries a particular texture, not alarm, not revelation, something quieter and harder to name, the texture of recognition, the feeling of arriving somewhere that has been visited before. That texture is real, it is felt in the body, or in the specific region where the body and the dreaming mind are still in conversation, but its source is the brain's own long familiarity with the number, its own careful preservation of the pattern across years of sleeping and waking and sleeping again. The number was not sent, it was carried, and the carrier, patient and efficient and almost entirely invisible, has been working in the dark of every night, without pause. The hypnagogic state does not last long. The spirals slow, the numerals stop their drifting, the room becomes less perceptible, not more, As sleep deepens and the visual cortex shifts its activity into the particular rhythms of the dreaming brain, REM sleep arrives in cycles through the night, each cycle longer than the last. The final cycles before waking, sometimes running for 30 or 40 minutes of continuous dreaming, that the waking mind will remember, if it remembers anything, as a single brief image or a mood that lingers into morning without quite attaching itself to a cause. In the longest of these REM cycles, the emotional processing Walker describes is doing its deepest work. The number, if it has gathered weight through the day, is somewhere in there, not as a number necessarily. The dreaming mind is not always literal, but as a shape, a quality, a recurring element in a landscape that the dream is assembling from available parts. The brain during REM sleep is building a world from the materials it has on hand, and the materials it has on hand are the things it has been paying attention to, weighted by the emotional significance those things have been assigned. A number that a family has been paying attention to for 40 years is, in this sense, deeply on hand. The monitors in Matthew Walker's sleep laboratory at Berkeley show the rolling peaks of REM stage activity with the patient regularity of something that has been happening every night for as long as human beings have been sleeping. The curves rise and fall, each wave a record of a brain doing the quiet maintenance work of memory and emotion that makes the next day possible. The laboratory is dark and precise. The person sleeping in it is connected to equipment that can track the depth and character of their dreaming with considerable accuracy. And yet, what is happening inside that dreaming, the particular content, the specific emotional weight being lifted from the specific memory, the exact shape the brain is assembling from the night's materials, remains in most of its detail beyond what any monitor can reach. The dreaming mind keeps its own record. Sleep researchers can measure when a person is dreaming. They can measure the approximate emotional valence of the dream, whether the dreaming brain is in a state consistent with distress or with calm, and they can track which memories are being consolidated versus which are being allowed to fade. What they cannot measure is the specific texture of the experience inside the dream, the particular quality of recognition that arrives when a familiar number appears in an unfamiliar landscape, the way a dreaming mind might encounter a number on a door in a dream house and feel, without understanding why, that this is important. That feeling is real to the person feeling it. It is also the product of a system that has been running night after night with remarkable consistency and no external assistance at all. There is something worth sitting with in that combination. The feeling is genuine. The mechanism is biological. Neither of those things cancels the other. A number that has accompanied a family for decades, appearing at births and deaths and significant crossings, noticed by grandmother and grandchild alike in the particular way that things are noticed when they have already been named as worth noticing. That number carries real weight in the sleeping mind, not because the world embedded it there, but because the family did. The love that passed the number down the table in a story is the same love that ensured it would be remembered. The brain stores what it loves, it consolidates what carries emotion, and it surfaces those things with its usual diligence in the long, patient hours of the night. The number persists because the love persists. The love is what does the carrying. Outside, the city that never fully goes dark is producing its ambient glow, the kind of light that does not illuminate anything specifically, but that keeps the total darkness at bay, a faint softness at the edge of the curtains, a dim shaping of the familiar objects in a room where someone is sleeping, the nightstand, the glass of water, the closed book with a number on its spine, the numerals just barely visible in the ambient light, sitting quietly on the surface of things, the way numbers do when no one is looking at them. The book has been closed for hours. The person who set it there has been asleep for hours. The number on the spine is doing nothing. It is carrying nothing. It is patient in the way that numbers are always patient, which is to say entirely, because patience requires awareness, and numbers are not aware. They are marks on a surface, arrangements of line and curve that the human eye has been trained to read as significant, that the human brain has been shaped over a very long development to receive with a particular kind of attention. The number on the spine of the closed book catches the faint ambient light and gives it back unchanged. It is the same number it was when the lamp was on. It is the same number it was the morning before and the morning before that. What changes is the mind that comes to it. A brain in REM sleep, somewhere behind the closed curtains of this room, is sorting through the day. It is moving through its nightly maintenance with the unhurried, systematic patience of something that has been doing this work without interruption since the first night this body slept. It is finding the emotionally tagged material, the moments that arrived carrying weight, and it is doing what it does with those moments, keeping the content, softening the charge, weaving the memory into a longer continuity. A number that appeared on a door, on a receipt, in a dream 3 nights ago, in a story told by someone who has been gone for 15 years. That number may be somewhere in the sorting. It will not be the only thing there. The brain holds a great deal, but the brain has been told, over a lifetime of particular attention, that this number is worth keeping near the surface. And so it keeps it, not as a secret or a signal, but as a feature of the landscape, one of the fixed points the brain uses to orient itself in the long narrative of a life. When the dreaming ends and the morning begins, the number will still be on the spine of the closed book on the nightstand, catching whatever light the morning brings. The person waking in this room will reach for the glass of water and see the book and feel, in the way that is now familiar and has been familiar since childhood, the small quiet recognition that attends the presence of a particular number. Not alarm, not revelation, the feeling of something known, the feeling of a thing that has always been in this place, which is to say everywhere, which is to say waiting. The waiting is the thing worth understanding. Numbers wait because they are everywhere. They are in the page counts of every book, the addresses of every building, the dates of every event, the measurements of every object. A world built on quantity contains numbers in everything, distributed across all surfaces and records, with the steady, indifferent abundance of something that does not know it is being looked for. And a mind that has been told one of these numbers is significant will find it, because finding it is not difficult. Finding it requires only the kind of attention that becomes, after sufficient practice, entirely automatic. The grandmother who first said the number at the kitchen table did not set a trap. She passed something down in the most ordinary way available to her, which is the way of story. She had noticed the number in her own life, in the particular places it had appeared at the particular moments that mattered, and she had found that noticing it gave her something, a sense of continuity, a small private order in the wider disorder of a life that, like all lives, contained more uncertainty than any person can comfortably hold. The number was a thread she could see. The thread was real enough to touch, and so she passed it. The child at the table who received it took it in the way children receive everything that arrives from someone they trust, completely, without question, with the particular receptive attention that is the specific gift of being young enough to believe that the people who love you know things worth knowing. The number was added to the inner catalog with the efficient, invisible thoroughness of a young brain in the process of assembling its model of the world, filed under things that matter, cross-referenced with the person who told me, and the way her voice sounded, and the light in the room that evening, and the warmth of being included in something. The number became, in that moment, inseparable from the love. This is what the brain in REM sleep is protecting when it consolidates that memory across the years. This is what the default mode network returns to in its nightly narrative building. This is what the hypnagogic mind surfaces in the corridor between waking and sleeping, in the slow spiral of familiar shapes. Not a code, not a signal from outside the system. The preserved residue of a moment of connection between two people, one of whom is still here, one of whom is not, and a number that happened to be in the room when they found each other. There is nothing small about that. The REM cycles continue through the night. The brain continues its work. The emotional weight of the oldest memories, the ones most thoroughly processed across the most years of sleeping, is the most thoroughly redistributed, which means the oldest memories often carry the most settled feeling in waking life. A number that was received in childhood from someone beloved will have been processed hundreds of times by the time a person is standing in a hospital corridor, or standing at a graveside, or standing in the kitchen of a house that once belonged to someone else, and noticing it on a door, on a form, on the face of a clock. By then, the noticing will feel like something. It will feel like the continuation of something that began a long time ago in a kitchen with better light than this one. It will feel, briefly, like company. That feeling is the brain doing its oldest and most faithful work, which is to maintain the continuity of a self across time, to find the thread that runs from then to now, to surface the evidence that despite everything, despite the losses and the changes and the long passage of days, something persists. Something was kept. The number was kept, because the moment was kept, because the love was kept. And the brain, in its efficient and unornamented way, uses what it has. It has the number. It offers the number. The number is accepted. A closed book on a nightstand is not doing anything. The number on its spine is not waiting, not signaling, not remembering. It is marks on a surface in a room that is almost entirely dark. The ambient light from the window finds it and leaves it unchanged. The same arrangement of lines it was when the lamp went out. The same arrangement it will be when the lamp comes on again in the morning. But the sleeping brain on the other side of the closed curtains is doing a great deal. It is moving through the accumulated material of a day that contained, as all days do, more than anyone could consciously attend to. It is finding the things it marked as important, and tending to them with the unhurried care of a system that has been doing this for long enough to be very good at it. It is lifting the weight from the moments that were heavy, and keeping the core of them, and weaving them into the longer story it maintains about who this person is, and where they have come from, and what has accompanied them. And among the things it is weaving in some cycle of this particular night, is a number that was first heard at a kitchen table, a number that has appeared since then in more places than anyone has thought to count, a number that the brain has been told in the particular language of attention and emotion and repetition across years is one of the things worth carrying. The brain carries it. This is not a mystery. This is sleep. The window in the room holds the ambient glow of a city that runs through the night without pausing. The book on the nightstand is still. The number on its spine catches the light, the way surfaces catch light, neutrally, without preference, without the awareness that would be required for preference. In the room, behind the closed curtains, in the slow rolling rhythms of the deepest part of the night, something is being sorted and kept and settled. By morning, the number will still be there. It will be on the book and on the receipt from yesterday and on the face of the clock and in the 43rd page of a notebook left open on the kitchen table. It will be in all the places where numbers are, which is to say everywhere, because numbers do not hide, and they do not concentrate, and they do not arrange themselves in the path of any particular person more than they arrange themselves everywhere else. They are simply part of the fabric of a counted world, distributed without preference across all the surfaces of things. The preference belongs to the brain, and the brain tonight is resting. It is doing the quiet work of the night, which is maintenance and consolidation and the soft, patient processing of everything the day contained. The number is somewhere in the materials it is sorting. It will be found because the brain finds what it has been told to find, and it has been told, across many years of sleeping and waking, that this one is worth finding. Outside, the city goes on at its nighttime pace. The ambient light holds. The number on the spine of the closed book sits in the faint glow of the window, the same as it has been all night, the same as it will be in the morning, unhurried and indifferent, and patient in the way that things are patient, when patience requires nothing of them at all. The sleeping mind, somewhere deep in the long-last cycle of the night, is dreaming